Alright, so in this chapter we're going to bring back some, actually a lot of the concepts that you've had previously. So I often like to say, we're really not introducing new content, it's just we're applying it in a way we hadn't done before. So please bear that in mind, because application is often the tricky part for students. So please, I hope you learned this the first time, and so that's already taken care of. Okay, but this chapter is all about homeostasis, right? It's all about balance. And so we're looking at fluid balance, electrolytes, which are sodiums, potassiums, calciums, charged ions, right? Well, I guess that's redundant, right? Electrolyte balance and acid base. So this will have to do with specifically with hydrogen ions and hydroxyl ions and that sort. So I say here, so who or what structures are going to maintain this? So they're going to be things that we have already looked at. We're going to have a strong role for the respiratory system and a strong role for the renal system, and that's because these two systems are excretory systems. How much should we have? Well, again, that's when we have to establish what our levels are supposed to be, and then figure out what happens when there's an increase or decrease. And then, of course, I ask you, as always, what do I already know? And I hope you understand that some of this balance, this regulation, of course, is going to be things you've already learned and understand. All right? So, again, the concept of balance is, right, homeostasis, right, a state of equilibrium. Okay. For water and electrolytes, I say, well, this means that the same amount that comes in is going out, right? So I do have to ask students, do you track this? Do you know exactly on a basis, a timely basis, what you've been drinking and what you've been eating and how much is in it? So think about your dietary recall and think about doing that all the time. All right. Okay, well, that's only half of it, right? Because the other half is you have to figure out about leaving the body. So you need to be carrying around a little cup, measuring, all the urine coming out, analyzing your feces and what you exhale. So probably the answer to this is no. And not just a no, but a resounding no, right? So we have to have a mechanism. Something in the body has to be able to retain the water or replenish it and the electrolytes. Or, and this is again, if you have too few, and excrete it, get rid of it, if there's too much in the body. So I do say keep in mind that water and electrolyte balance are interdependent. And this is because, right, your fluids in the body, the first time we use fluids, while they are mostly water, they have these electrolytes in them. So all the things we're going to talk about are actually solutions, not pure water or pure sodium or pure potassium or whatever. It's solutions, blood, lymph, cerebrospinal fluid, right, intracellular solution, cytoplasm, right, all kinds of things. So we know that in a solution there's some part solvent and some part solute. So water is always a solvent. And then the solutes will be things, right, like glucose, amino acids, vitamins, right, sodiums, potassiums, calciums. And we will be looking at the charged stuff, so that won't be the glucose and amino acids and vitamins here in this chapter. We'll be looking at the charged things. And so the number of these in a certain amount of water give us a concentration. All right? So here I mentioned that your bodily fluids are solutions. All right? The chemistry of life doesn't happen in dry situations. It happens in wet situations, right? So I say again what I've talked about in the last slide, that solutions are some part solutes and some part solvent. So solutes, any molecule dissolved, right, includes proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, I said glucose, and electrolytes, and we're going to focus on electrolytes. So electrolytes are anything that carries a charge, and generally this is a dissociated from a salt, like sodium chloride, magnesium chloride, right, bicarbonates, and so forth. Water is always going to be the solvent. All right, so this solution is solute and solvent. And solvent, right, and water moves. So water is the solvent, universal solvent, and it moves, right? We call this osmosis, right? And so water, we've been teaching you this since IAP 1, that water moves across membranes to maintain balances. And we address this in IAP 1 as, looking at isotonic and hypertonic and hypotonic solutions. And we always said in AMP1 that water follows the solutes. Well, we've been reinforcing this in A&P too, right? When I said, well, how do you absorb all that water that has been dumped into your digestive tract while you were doing digestion? And we said, well, when you move an amino acid or a glucose or a fructose or whatever, water follows it because water follows the solutes. All right? Now, the body's water content falls out fairly unequally, and it's not the same from person to person. And one of the biggest determinants of this is the amount of adipose, because adipose resists water, right? They don't get along. Fat and oils, right? Oils and water don't mix. So the more adipose you have, well, by default, you'd have less water. So infants with very low adipose are really quite a bit of water, right? Adults, it's lower, significantly lower. An average adult female is only about 52%, while an average male is about 63%. And this is because, again, an average adult female has more adipose tissue. And an average adult male has more lean muscle. And muscle does incorporate water with it. And if you don't understand that, we'll just go buy some meat at the store and go and cook it, right? You can see all the fluids that come out when you cook it. And then the elderly can have considerably higher amounts of fat or adipose, and so much less water. Okay, I said even within your body there's quite a bit of variation. So the brains and kidneys have a lot of fluid in them, whereas teeth, which are bones, and bones considerably less, but teeth having the lowest amount according to this chart. Now, and you don't have to remember where all the fluids are in the body. That's not the point of this. Fluid compartments. So where do I find these fluids? So you've got blood, we've talked a lot about. You have lymph vessels, we've talked about, cerebrospinal, right? Fluid through the ventricles and everything. The cells, right? And of course the interstitial spaces in the interstitium, which actually has just been elevated to an organ status theoretically, right, or hypothetically. We haven't decided yet, but it was published in Nature last week that this could actually be an organ. And as such, we have to treat it. But regardless of organ or not, the interstitium or interstitial space is all this stuff surrounding the cells of the body, the organized cells. All right, so it's between. That's why it's right, between stuff. So we divide these fluid compartments into intracellular and extracellular. So intra within the cell and extra outside of the cell. All right. So we have a variety. So there's different amounts of fluid. So the volumes differ in these compartments, and the solutes differ in them. But overall, the total concentration of solutes in a cell is equal to the total concentration here, which is equal to the total concentration here. And that's why we say that the solutions themselves are isotonic, right? Which ends up being like 300 milliosmoles, I believe. But again, you don't have to know that number, but that's just to illustrate the point. But in spite of having a total equal number of solutes, we know that already from A&P1 and the chapter on the nervous system that potassium is very high inside of his cells and very low outside of cells, whereas sodium is very high outside of cells and very low inside of cells. So that's what we mean by different, right, compartments of different volumes and varying compositions. All these compartments are basically separated by, you got it, membranes, right, these phospholipid layers. So, and this walks you through all the different, compartments that are extra outside the cells. All right. So here again, intracellular is the most. By far and away, it's 60% of the total volume of water. You have about 42 liters in the body overall, and most of it's inside the cells because though they're small, there's trillions of them, right? So you have a lot of fluid collectively, right? And again, 25 liters, but just understand the most is found in the intracellular. Generally, this compartment is fairly stable, right? We have pumps that keep the sodiums, potassiums, and other, right, solutes at a fairly constant concentration. And I say, well, this is important because think about the consequences to cells if you place them in hypertonic or hypotonic solutions, right? Hypertonic ones, they shrink, right, because water moves out of the cell. And in hypotonic, they swell because water moves in. All right, the extracellular, so the other, about 40% of the body, and a lot of this is in the plasma, but most of it's in the interstitial. You can see that. So most of the extracellular, shown here in blue, red, and green, is actually in the interstitial spaces. All right, there's only about 5 or 6 liters, right, of blood, and it's about 55% of that's plasma. So, 3 or so liters here in plasma. And I say, recall what you can find in plasma. Plasma is probably the most unstable. And this changes because this is when we absorb from our diet, that's where it goes, right? When we're dealing with the kidneys, that's where it goes, right? So when we're breathing oxygen and carbon dioxide going out, that's where it goes, right? So plasma is probably the one that changes the most. But it does exchange with the interstitial fluids, right? And how? Well, we've already seen this, right? When we talked about cardiovascular system, we said, whoa, check it out, right? We're inside the blood vessel and we get to the capillary, and the capillary allows a bunch of stuff to get pushed out. And of course the interstitial then pushes it into the cells, and the cells push stuff out into the interstitial and they push it back to the plasma. So it exchanges across these membranes, right? The other is really your other fluids that are on. These are still extracellular. Lymph fluid, your aqueous humors and vitreous humors, your cerebrospinal fluids, your synovial fluids, and serous membranes all provide some fluids. All right. Now here's a slide to look at this idea of body composition, and this is really nice because we have the that's inside the cells, and then stuff that's outside or extracellular, but we've compare the plasma and the interstitial, and this is an important difference. Okay, so here if we think about the extracellular fluids are generally similar, so the blue and the red look pretty close until we get here. Proteins are very high in the plasma, they are very low in the interstitial. We keep them in the plasma and we keep them in the cells. We don't exchange those, and one of the reasons, of course, is proteins are far too large to move in most circumstances, so they stay in their compartments. These are much smaller things, and they can move around, but that depends on if there's a gate, right, or channel in the membrane. Right, so I say here, extracellular fluids in general, whether it's interstitial or plasma, have sodium and chloride, and these guys always go together, right, positive and negative, right, and bicarbonate. So here as we look at this, where's the red and the blue, the largest and most different from this peach? Well, it's right here. Right, these first 3, sodium chloride, bicarbonates. And protein is exclusive for the plasma. All right, intracellular fluids, right, so those inside the cells shown in peach here, potassium, magnesium, right, so potassium, magnesium, phosphate, calcium, right, and of course protein. So there is calcium extracellular as well, but it is higher, especially when we consider the cells. So again, that's things like your muscle cells have an awful lot of calcium in them, right? So, all right, recall the following. Here's a membrane again, because we said that's where we're going to see these exchanges occur, because all the compartments are defined by membranes. So, and these membranes have these, right, gates and pumps and channels, okay, in them. And so here's a nice cartoon looking at the concentration of sodiums and potassiums. So I say most bodily fluids are neutral in charge. So we're about equal when we get inside or outside, away from the membrane. We're about equal in the number of positive and negative, the number of cations and anions. At the membrane, and we talked to this in AP1, there is a charge. Okay, so the charge comes about because of some leakage that occurs, especially in potassium, right? Potassium ions. I said, while there are channels that leak, there are pumps that work to return potassium to the inside and sodium to the outside. So these guys are moving down their concentration gradients, right? High sodium out is moving in, and high potassium in is moving out. So, but it turns out there is a charge that builds up, and we say that the outside here is positive compared to the inside. All right, so we'll come back and talk about this movement between the compartments, but that gives you a good introduction to these compartments and balance.